Hi, I'm Cheryl Jackson. Welcome to Your Voice. The stereotypes go something like this. Little girls like verbal and emotional interaction. Little boys would rather be running around doing something physical. The legitimacy of these stereotypes may be up for debate, but one thing is clear. When it comes to education scores, boys and girls are different. According to the Canadian Council on Learning, there is a significant literacy gap between the sexes. The Council found girls outperform boys in reading and writing by a large margin, and boys outperform girls in science and math by a small margin. So what's behind these gaps? Are boy and girl brains fundamentally different? How do we help both sexes optimize learning and close the gaps? With us to discuss the issue is Michael Reist. He's been a teacher for 27 years and is currently head of the English department at Robert F. Hall Catholic Secondary School in Caledon, Ontario. He's a popular speaker on the topic of gender differences in learning, and he's the author of The Dysfunctional School: Uncomfortable Truths and Awkward Insights on School, Learning, and Teaching. Joining us via webcam from Chicago, Illinois is Lise Elliott. She's an associate professor of neuroscience at the Rosalind Franklin University of Medicine and Science in Chicago. She's also author of the book Pink Brain, Blue Brain: How Small Differences Grow into Troublesome Gaps and What We Can Do About It. Also via webcam, we have physician and psychologist Leonard Sachs. He's the author of Boys Adrift: The 5 Factors Driving the Growing Epidemic of Unmotivated Boys and Underachieving Men, and the forthcoming book, Girls on the Edge: The 4 Factors Driving the New Crisis for Girls. He's also founder and executive director of the National Association for Single-Sex Public Education. He joins us today from Chester County, Pennsylvania. Welcome to everybody. Michael in studio, Lise and Leonard on Skype. Thanks. Let's start with the Canadian Council figures. How significant is the literacy gap between boys and girls? Leonard, I'll start with you.
Specifically at the province of Ontario, because when I spoke in Toronto for the Toronto board a few months ago, they shared with me EQAO data, not only from Toronto, but from across the province. So, for example, writing proficiency at grade 6 across the province of Ontario, you find that 78% of girls across the province of Ontario score proficient, compared with 57% of boys. Well, how big a gap is that? 78% of girls, 57% of boys. Let's put it in context. Let's compare students in Ontario from households earning more than $100,000 a year with students in Ontario across all school boards, Anglophone and Francophone, with household income less than $50,000 a year. And what you find there is that 85% of students from households with income more than $100,000 a year score proficient, compared with only 71% of students from lower income households, so a 14% gap. Now, if I were to ask you, why is it the case that affluent kids in Ontario do better on a writing test than low-income kids? You'd have many reasons that you could come up with, I think, at a moment's notice. Affluent kids more likely to have parents who attended university, more likely to have parents who read and encourage their kids to read, more likely to be discussing homework with their kids, and on and on. Those are all good reasons. But if I ask you, why are boys in Ontario lagging behind girls in writing proficiency at grade 6 across the province? Remember, when we're comparing boys categorically with girls categorically across Ontario, we are comparing brothers with sisters. And when I've spoken in Toronto, Mississauga, Hamilton, Burlington, St. Catharines, I have heard from so many parents who've told me that their daughter, Emily, is excited about school, motivated, very concerned about getting good marks, while their son, Justin, is a goofball, is more concerned about getting to the next level in his video game. The differences in ability are trivial to non-existent. The differences in motivation are very large. Across Ontario today, unlike 30 years ago, boys tend to regard academic achievement as unmasculine.
Okay. Lise, let's talk about maths and sciences then. Is it the same kind of story? Are we talking about the same thing in the gap?
Well, the gap in math and science has declined a bit, apparently. I'm more familiar with the American data, the National Assessment for Education Progress. And boys do still score higher than girls in math, particularly in high school. In elementary school, there's no gap at the moment, and the easier the test, the less the gap. So I think girls have made a lot of progress in science and math. We certainly have a long way to go. There's still glass ceiling issues, but I think we are seeing improvement, at least at the K-12 level.
All right, Lisa, now where are we seeing these gaps, though? It sounds like you're saying in high school they are greater than they are in elementary school. Is that true?
That's right. For math, boys are still outperforming girls in the National Assessment for Educational Progress, which is a more challenging test. Statewide tests, again, I'm sorry, I'm not as familiar with the Canadian data, but statewide tests in the U.S. show almost an elimination of the math gap between boys and girls, which is very encouraging.
All right, Michael, you teach boys and girls. What accounts for these differences, do you think? These gaps in their achievement?
Well, my research tells me that the developmental timeline between boys and girls is very different. At Robert F. Hall, the school where I teach, we laugh every year at the girls who come in. Some of these girls could pass for a supply teacher. The developmentally, cognitively, biologically, they're further along than the boys. Some of the boys could pass for grade 4 or 5. I think one of the reasons we're seeing these huge differences in EQAO tests is this difference in cognitive and biological development, that the boys are, the wrong word would be behind. I like to say that they're on a different developmental timeline. And when EQAO tests kids at grade 3, 6, 9, and 10, I say in a way they're comparing apples for redness, and the green apple isn't quite red yet, and it's an unfair comparison.
Okay, Lise, let's talk about language and verbal skills for a minute, because we did mention in the introduction that we tend to think of girls as being more language-oriented, more verbal. Is there any truth to that? Do they acquire those skills more easily than boys?
Yes, girls do score higher than boys on most tests of verbal ability, reading, writing, spelling. However, the gap grows larger through childhood. So in infancy, or toddlerhood, there's only about a 1-month difference between when a toddler girl will speak, say, 200 words versus when a boy will speak 200 words. We do start seeing gaps in reading performance, as you've discussed, in elementary school, and then they're considerably larger by high school. So according to the thesis of my book, the point is that, yes, there are biological differences between boys and girls, but learning and culture magnify these things as children segregate into their preferred play groups and girls talk more to each other, and their parents talk more to girls because girls elicit more conversation. Boys are busier and more active, and they engage in other types of play that are good for their brains, but unfortunately not giving them the verbal and literacy stimulation that they need, arguably more than girls in early childhood.
All right, Leonard, now let's talk about the boys for a minute, because conversely, we hear that little boys like to run around. They find it harder to sit still or to focus in the traditional sort of classroom. What truth is there to that?
Well, I'm very uneasy with any generalization about boys are this way, girls are that way, because there's so much variation among boys, so much variation among girls. Believe me, my daughter is constantly jumping off the couch and onto the floor and running around. But no, I think the interesting question for parents in Ontario is, why the change? 30 years ago, boys in Ontario were, and we've got good data on this, were more anxious than their sisters to get good marks. Today, the boys have lost that motivation. So the important comparison is not between boys and girls, but boys today compared with boys 30 years ago. What's happened to education in Ontario that boys today regard educational achievement as a masculine, which they did not 30 years ago? And I think we've got good answers to that question.
Okay, Michael, I think you want to add something to this.
I think Dr. Sachs raises a very important point. The internet went public in 1993. Kids born in 1993 are now in grade 11. People ask me over 27 years, have you seen any difference in kids? And for many years, I say kids are kids. But in the last 5 or 6 years, these cyberspace kids are now in our secondary schools, and I feel there is a profound difference. A profound difference between school space and cyberspace. Kids are coming to us from a spatial world into schools which are still logical, linear, verbal. And I know Dr. Elliott talks about the way in which culture amplifies the differences. And the use of the computer, the time spent in cyberspace, in a way it's a gender issue, because I feel generally that the boys are spending an incredible amount of time in cyberspace. And when they come to my English class, the leap to read text is a huger leap than it was even 5 years ago. And I think in secondary school, certainly in English departments, we're all feeling this incredible pressure from kids for whom reading is becoming oil and water. Because, again, because of the differences between cyberspace and school space.
Sure, okay. Well, but why would you say that boys are spending more time in cyberspace?
Because, again, my research tells me that the male brain is a spatial brain. The male brain prefers the visual and the spatial, and cyberspace is a feast of visual and spatial.
Lise, are boys and girl brains actually wired differently?
Well, that's what I set out to find when I was doing the research for my book. And at this point in time, I would say no, neuroscience has not identified any clear, noticeable differences between the structure of boys' brains and girls' brains, or even functional activation. There are more differences between adult men and adult women's brains, which leads me to think that the differences in adulthood are reinforced and programmed through learning. But clearly, even though we can't put our finger on which synapses are affected, there are behavioral differences between boys and girls, some of which we can attribute to prenatal testosterone. One is activity level, as we've been discussing. So boys are more active than girls on average. It's not a gaping difference. There's plenty of girls who run around more than their brothers, but on average, boys and girls differ by about half a standard deviation in activity level. Verbal skills, too, as I said, the difference shows up early, suggesting to us that girls may have a little bit easier time latching on to language. But then they're launched into our culture, which offers two very, very different ways to be. Parents with different expectations, peers reinforcing different skills, and in our laissez-faire society where kids have ultimate choice to do what they want, they will reinforce the things they're good at. Girls with the social and relational skills, boys with the spatial and physical skills.
All right, Leonard, how important do you think those differences, if Lise says there's small differences, I'm not sure if you agree with that, but if there are differences, how important are they?
Well, again, I think looking at data from Ontario and other provinces across time is very useful here, because the fact is, in Ontario 30 years ago, boys thought academic achievement was pretty cool, and today they don't. So obviously that change can't be attributed to any sort of sex difference in the brain. I think Mr. Rice makes a good point about the effect of what I call the cyber bubble, the effect of these new technologies. But I don't agree with Mr. Rice that boys are disadvantaged compared with girls. I think boys and girls are both disadvantaged by these new technologies, but they're disadvantaged differently. So when I spoke to the Ministry of Children and Youth Services in Ontario back in November, provincial meeting, I heard from all these staff who are also parents about how so many boys across the province stayed home from school the second week in November so that they could play Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2, which is the best-selling video game in Canadian history. But the girls are staying up past midnight, texting, instant messaging, frantic about who posted that nasty wall on their Facebook page. We now have new Canadian data showing more than 1 in 5 Canadian girls is exhibiting non-suicidal self-injury. That is, she's cutting herself with a razor blade, she's burning herself with matches. More than 1 in 5 Canadian girls. Very rare among boys, very common among girls. This behavior was practically unknown in both Canada and the United States 30 years ago. Cutting yourself with razors. When I did my first psychiatry rotation in Philadelphia 30 years ago, we had a young woman admitted she'd been cutting herself with razors. She was put in the locked ward on the suicide unit. Things are changing. And this cannot be attributed to brain differences because the brain hasn't changed in 30 years. Why is it the case that today 1 in 5 Canadian girls are cutting themselves with razor blades? And that's a low estimate. Why is it the case that boys today across the province increasingly regard getting to the next level in their video game as more important than getting a good grade in their French examination? These are new phenomena. They didn't exist 30 years ago. They cannot be attributed to sex differences in the brain. I think we've got a good understanding of the answers to these questions, but these are the questions we need to be asking.
All right, thank you. Well, we always like to hear from other parents. So recently we went out to the Ontario Science Centre, that's in Toronto, to get your questions about gender and learning. And here's one father's question.
Hi, I'm Dylan Clark from Toronto, and I'm the father of 2 little girls, one 7-year-old, one 2-year-old here. And I'm a bit concerned about all the emphasis that's being placed on supposedly biological differences between the genders. I'm concerned that people are discovering little tiny little hormonal or different differences in the brain chemistry, and I'm concerned that too much emphasis might be put on those little tiny differences. And I have a question if you could comment on that. I'd be glad to learn more about that. Thanks.
All right, well, let's go around the table and see what everybody thinks. Leonard, I'll start with you.
Well, I think the parent makes a very good choice. Critics, for example, of single-sex education will assert that the argument for single-sex education is based on these trivial or non-existent differences in brain chemistry. But you know, when Dr. Spence, back in October it is, the director of education in the Toronto board, when he said, let's offer a boys' public school, it wasn't based on any of these false notions about brain chemistry or brain activity. It was based on an argument for social justice. You know, if you live in Cabbagetown, you know, east of the provincial parliament, west of the Don Valley Parkway, and you think your son might do better in a boys' school, or you think your daughter might do better at a girls' school, you have some wonderful options. Upper Canada College, Branksome Hall, these are magnificent schools. I've visited both of them. There's just one little problem. They're going to charge you more than $20,000 a year to attend those schools. So what if you think your daughter, your son might do better at a boys' school or girls' school, but you don't have $20,000 a year? Dr. Spence was saying, let's make a boys' public school available as a choice. One, there's more than 600 schools in the Toronto board. He said, let's make one of those schools a boys' schools for parents who want that option. We're not saying that every child should be in a single-sex classroom. We're saying, why not let every parent have a choice?
All right, well, I think that school has been postponed for now, but
yes, it has.
I would like to talk about that in just a minute. But Lisa, I'd like to ask you first, what do you say to that, Father? Are we making too big a deal out of these small biological differences?
Well, I do think so, particularly since the biology is simply not, doesn't support what the pseudoscience out there is suggesting. And there is a lot of belief out there that boys and girls are hardwired differently. And with all due respect to Dr. Sachs, it was his book that really pushed that idea very strongly, along with the writings of Michael Gurian, is another expert who has claimed that boys and girls' brains are fundamentally hardwired differently, and that is leading parents, I think, to a greater perception of differences that actually exist. Yeah. And as we all know, really parent expectations and teacher expectations go a long way towards what children actually achieve. So I think we should give kids more the benefit of the doubt and not stereotype them so early.
All right,
the closing chapter of my book is entitled Beyond Pink and Blue. The whole point of my book is to break down gender stereotypes and broaden educational horizons. Dr. Elliott has profoundly misrepresented both the substance and intention to my book, which is to broaden educational horizons, to get more girls excited about computer science and physics, and to get more boys excited about art and music and poetry.
All right, Leonard, let's talk about that for a minute then. What do you think single-sex schools offer children? What are the advantages?
I don't think that's a useful question. Good schools are better than bad schools. There are some very fine good, co-ed schools, and there are some single-sex schools that are terrible schools. Kids come in all different shapes and sizes, and it's important to recognize and celebrate that diversity. As I said before, we're not suggesting that every child should be in a single-sex school.
Okay, it sounds like you're
suggesting that parents should have a choice.
Choice, exactly. Okay, Michael?
I would also promote the idea of choice and diversity. I think, though, that Ontario, we have a very particular culture that doesn't deal well with treating people differently. And we are very proud of the fact that we treat everyone the same. And I quote Mel Levine, who said to treat everybody the same is to treat them unfairly. And I think it's time for greater diversity and greater options and choices for parents and greater variety in the way we treat kids. I would note in the province of Ontario, the educational system was really designed by Egerton Ryerson. And Egerton Ryerson was very proud to look at his watch at 10 o'clock in the morning, and he would say, I know what every student in Ontario is doing at this moment. And I think that attitude is still very pervasive in Ontario education, the one-size-fits-all. And whenever anybody talks about differentiation or any kind of even critical reflection on education that would lead to different approaches, there's caution about this.
And do you think children would benefit then from single-sex school? Boys would do better? You do?
Absolutely. But I'm afraid of the pathologizing of boys. In the recent Toronto District model, the impression I got was that we were going to have these special kind of emergency room classrooms. You know, these kids were going to be identified and placed, and so it has that whole aura of dysfunction and disability,
Fixing
and we're going
problems.
fixing a problem.
Right.
We're going to rescue you from yourself. And I think it's absolutely clear from thousands of years of history that single-sex education really has been the norm before the war, and there's nothing wrong with single-sex education. I don't see it happening very soon in Ontario.
All right, well, let's hear from another.
I think there's a lot of things wrong with single-sex education, and I'm very uneasy when people cite the fact, and it is a fact, that before 1940, many school boards offered single-sex classrooms, because those were the bad old days. And if you look at the single-sex schools that were in existence before 1940, you find that the boys learned physics and woodworking, and the girls learned home economics, whatever that was. So we don't want to go back to that bad old era. We're using this format to break down gender stereotypes and broaden educational horizons. You know, Dr. Elliott attacked my book a moment ago, but in her book on page 203, she recommends the best way to get boys excited about reading is to have them read Captain Underpants and war and science fiction and books about very stereotypical male subjects. I can tell you about schools like Upper Canada College, St. Andrews College, Crescent Academy, where the boys love The Secret Garden, they love Jane Eyre, they love Romeo and Juliet, they love the Judy Blume books. If you understand gender differences, you can break down gender stereotypes, and that same boy who loves hockey and football will love Jane Eyre. That same girl who loves Gossip Girl will love All Quiet on the Western Front.
All right, we do want to hear from another parent right now. This is a mom who has a question about the very structure of elementary schools.
Hi, my name's Lorene. I'm a mother of a 6-year-old boy, and I'm under the impression our school system is geared more for girls. Is my perception correct?
All right. Well, let me go to you, Lise, because although you're in the U.S., I'm sure it's not a different situation than it is here. Would you agree with that, Mom?
I think that some classrooms are less boy-friendly than they should be, but certainly not all of them. And I'm happy to live in a district of public schools where there's no test score gaps between the boys and girls. And I can tell you one thing we have is a lot of male teachers at the lower elementary level, which I think is very advantageous for both boys and girls. But the key thing really is that teachers, now they're taught, or the best teaching is to involving what they call differentiated instruction, where you identify the needs of every child and you try to tailor the instruction to exactly that child's needs. And the difference between boys and girls is smaller than the range of ability within either gender. And so a good teacher will try to reach every child in the classroom. I think there are a small subset of classrooms where teachers may be less tolerant of boys' activity levels and may be less able to accommodate their lack of verbal experience coming into the classroom. But by and large, I don't think that that is the rule.
Well, Lise, what needs to happen to address that situation then?
Well, I think we need a greater focus on early literacy, and not the drill and kill kind of stuff, but interaction with text and words, talking to boys, making eye contact, eliciting conversation, teaching phonetic skills in a play-based way. I think the Montessori curriculum has been a great example of a way to use multisensory stimulation to get kids on board for reading, boys and girls, as early as kindergarten and first grade. I'm not trying to push the academic curriculum earlier, but I do think that more play with text and words and letters will get boys on track better for their reading and writing skills, which is, as I mentioned, a smaller gap in elementary school, and then it continues to grow as boys simply spend less time in front of books.
All right. Michael?
Cheryl, this mother's comment that we just heard, it's probably the most common comment I hear. I get so many calls from mothers, children grade 3, and they feel that the system is hostile to the nature of their child, particularly boys. I think the thing we need most in Ontario is professional development. I think teachers need to be more aware of these differences. I think they need to read Leonard Sachs. I think they need to read Lise Eliot. I think that these, both sides of the debate are extremely important. The truth lies somewhere in between, but teachers need to be aware of this fascinating area of brain differences, which has changed the way I approach the classroom completely. completely.
How has it changed for you?
In terms of empathy, and you know, there are lots of tricks and tips that you can give to teachers, but for me the number one issue in education is, are you empathetic toward the child? And a boy, a restless bodily kinesthetic boy squirming in his chair, can tell that you're on his side, as opposed to labeling it, you know, seeing it as dysfunctional and so on. You see that there's a natural component to it, so you are much more empathetic. And kids pick up on that, as opposed to the teacher who doesn't understand these differences as well and becomes hostile toward them. And then that creates tension in the classroom.
All right, thank you very much for that. We only have a couple of minutes left. Leonard, I'll start with you. What would be your best advice to parents who are thinking about gender and learning?
Well, I always say go to the school board, talk to the principal, ask a simple question. Are boys allowed to throw snowballs on school grounds? 30 years ago, basically every school board in the province said, fine, sure, absolutely. I can tell you about many parents whose fondest memory of schools is charging the teachers on the playground. Today, most public schools in the province prohibit throwing snowballs on school grounds. Not necessary. I understand liability concerns. I practiced medicine in the United States for 22 years, but there's a very simple solution that I saw at St. Andrew's College in Aurora, and that is if you want to throw snowballs, you go to the football field. If you don't want somebody throwing snowballs at you, you don't go to the football field. Inbounds, out of bounds. Boys understand inbounds versus out of bounds. In my book, Boys Adrift, I provide many examples, many from Canadian schools, that teachers have used to accommodate these differences so that you create a culture in which it's cool, it's masculine to get an A in French literature. In most schools today, boys regard it as unmasculine to care about getting a good grade.
Thank you very much, Leonard. Lise, what advice would you have for parents?
Well, I do think it's important to be vigilant about whether you feel your child is being treated fairly. And, you know, there are definitely a lot of teachers who love boys, but if there's any sense of intolerance, I think that should be brought to the principals and the school board chairman. But I'd actually like to reinforce what Dr. Sachs was saying. You know,
I'm afraid, Lisa, I'm afraid we're out of time. I'm so sorry. We have used up that 2 minutes when we're done. Thank you, Michael, for being here. Thank you, Lise. Thank you, Leonard. My guests have been Michael Reist, Lise Elliott, and Leonard Sachs. For more information on gender and learning, we have articles, research, links, and blogs. You can go to our site, click on Your Voice and this show topic. We've also posted upcoming shows, so if you have a question for one of them, send it in. We'll ask the experts. If you have a show idea, send that in too. We want to cover the issues that affect you. Your Voice airs every Sunday night at 6 p.m. on TVO, and we're online anytime at tvoparents.com. I'm Cheryl Jackson. Thank you for watching.